Welcome to the 5th season of The Nature of Nurture with Dr. Leslie Carr, a podcast for your mental health. I'm your host, Leslie. If you're watching this podcast right now, you can find the audio version in any podcast app. And if you're listening, you can also watch this episode on YouTube at The Nature of Nurture. You can find that link in the show notes. We're here today with Yeshaia Blakeney, who also goes by Shai. Shai is the co-founder and co-CEO of Recover Integrity and Antedote, addiction and dual diagnosis treatment programs here in Los Angeles. Shai is also an addiction expert with over 20 years of experience working in substance abuse and mental health. Sober since the age of 21, Shai has a deep understanding of the youth addiction and recovery process, and he specializes in working with people who have either been failed by the mainstream 12-step model or who are looking for an unorthodox approach. In Shai's universe, lasting recovery has a spiritual dimension, and that's what I'm excited to talk to him about today. Shai and I know each other through our work. One of my primary areas of expertise as a psychologist is addictions. And whenever we chat, we always have these pretty off-the-wall, totally quantum conversations. I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you. We're going to talk about the therapeutic use of psychedelics in treating addictions, the nature of reality, and so much more. Welcome, Yeshaia Blakeney. So before I ask you my first question, I'm just going to tell you something, and then you can decide later, Bree, if you want to keep this in. Like, it's just I'm agnostic on this, but there's something I want to tell you in all sincerity because I think it's a really fun way to kind of like kick off this conversation. So I kind of have like a philosophy of my interviews where what I really love to do is, I prepare quite a bit in advance. I think about all the questions I want to ask a person. And then pretty much without fail, what I do is I just put them to the side, tend to forget about them. I like to know the first question that I'm going to ask someone and have like a slight sense of direction of like what, where I want to take the conversation, but generally speaking, ditch my notes. Yeah. And I kind of have a theory of the case because when I listen to other people conduct interviews where maybe they're like a little bit greener at it, there can be this, they prepare all their questions and someone can say something and they like miss a really good follow-up question because they're too glued to like the question that they have an agenda around that they want to ask next. And I just have this feeling based on the conversations that you and I have had in the past that this is going to be a particularly fun version of that, I'm just going to ask you the first question and then we are just going to go wherever this conversation takes us, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. But so my first question for you is, you are ultimately an advocate for something that is in the big scheme of things pretty unconventional, which is the therapeutic use of hallucinogens to treat addictions. And I wonder if you can kick us off today by telling me and our listeners a little bit about kind of what informs your thinking there, what fuels your passion for it. What are your thoughts about the therapeutic use of hallucinogens in treating addictions?
Great question.
Thanks.
Good to see you, Leslie.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
Honestly, at the core is my experience with psychedelics, my personal experience with psychedelics.
Yeah.
And so at the core of it, I think is an experience of utilizing psychedelics in a way that gave me more access to depth or give me more access to depth in a way that helped my empathy grow, helped my awareness grow in a way that was exciting and interesting and mysterious. And so at the core was a personal experience. In terms of its usage in, let's say, treatment of addiction or depression, anxiety, and other conditions, when you work in the field of mental health and substance abuse in the arena that I work in, you see a lot of people suffering and a lot of people not getting sober, not recovering, some dying.
Yeah.
And if you pay close attention, a lot of the time that has to do with people's awareness. Mm-hmm. And I don't just mean awareness in the cognitive sense. I also mean awareness in the sense of being connected.
Yeah.
Like that kind of full body awareness, that full heart and head connection awareness.
Kind of coherence on some level.
Yeah, coherence, connection. And that's something very tragic about that. Just as a person to person, you're working with somebody and you can recognize that the schema that they're operating under doesn't allow for them to be able to take the next step.
Mm.
And so I think most therapeutic modalities are attempting to help either get obstacles out of the way in order for that to happen or to raise consciousness in some way. And I think, I mean, anybody who's paid any attention knows that psychedelics is probably one of the most predictable ways to do that. And the downside is very low to me. So like the risk of the downside is probably much lower than one would think. Yeah.
We will come back to the downsides and the risks in a moment, just because I think it's really interesting from a clinical point of view, in the sense of what makes other people afraid of this in ways that you're not. But it's just, in terms of everything that you just said, there are so many different directions that I could take this in. But I feel like one of them is that part of what I hear you saying is that there is something that hallucinogens give a person that are hard to achieve another way. Not impossible, but if nothing else, it might take more time.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a more expansive worldview, an expansive sense of one's own consciousness,
Yeah.
an expansive sense of one's ability to relate to themselves and to others. And like, does that feel...
Yeah, I would add in there a sense of the sacred.
Yeah.
Which I think becomes very difficult to walk away from any significant psychedelic experience, at least in the period before you forget what just happened.
Yeah.
To come back with the same gestalt around how you think about the sacred. I mean, there are some people obviously that do psychedelics that, they don't necessarily believe in God or become religious, but I think there's very few people that have had significant psychedelic experiences that would deny the spiritual aspect of reality anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so there's all of,
it opens you up to the mysteries of the universe, if nothing else, right? Like it awakens, if it wasn't already awake, a sense of curiosity about maybe what we don't know or don't fully understand or have misunderstood or something, right?
Yeah. And that even, I sort of have a Neoplatonic parts of me schema. And so I would say not just the mysteries, like it opens, you actually can experience higher orders of reality. So there's the mysteries, and then there's those things that were mysterious yesterday that you're now experiencing on psychedelics, which you go, oh, this is a higher order of reality that I still don't fully understand, but it's not as mysterious as it was yesterday. I didn't know it existed. Can
you say a little bit more about what you mean by higher order of reality? What does that mean for you?
I mean, that becomes a very difficult thing to talk about, obviously.
Yeah, sure.
But, I think like one example that Carl Jung, talked about was synchronicities. And it's one actually the only instances in his philosophy, really, that he moves out of psychology, right? I mean, people think about Jung as a deep mystic, but in fact, he was really attempting to use biology and psychology analysis as a means to understand religion, spirituality, et cetera. So he actually really grounded almost all of it in the mind and in the brain. Obviously, there's complexity and argument about that. He's a complex thinker.
And the constraints at the time. I think he was really wrestling with things in a way that there were some constraints at the time of the understanding of consciousness.
Totally, and also what he was willing to say, and he had a career and all that stuff.
Yes.
But obviously his idea of synchronicity was clearly a connection between a conscious experience and something happening in the world that can't be explained by normative materialism, physics, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that's like a coincidence, synchronicity. But what you experience on psychedelics is the interconnections of reality that are, and yourself and us and time, that normally are filtered out. I mean, period, end of story. I think for humans to function, we filter out certain aspects of reality, but there are higher, I call them superordinate orders that exist above ours. I also think there are intelligences above our everyday waking intelligence, which we shouldn't be so pompous about. And you have access to that in certain mystical states and spiritual states, and sometimes just sort of odd experiences, weird experiences, and psychedelics.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you listed was that, when you had initially these opening experiences with psychedelics, that one of the things that it opened up for you was empathy.
Oh,
And
yeah, sure.
I wonder if you can say a little bit more about kind of what shifted for you personally. In a moment, I want to talk more about just what you see in other people and your clinical work and stuff. But was it empathy for yourself? Was it empathy for others? Like, what exactly opened up for you?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I had done I'm in recovery, so I used to drink and party and all that stuff. And I had done psychedelics. First time I ever did psychedelics, I was 11.
God.
So I'm from Berkeley. This is like a normal rite of passage in Berkeley. But I got sober at 21, and so I went and did ayahuasca at I think I was like 30, my early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And my motivation to go drink ayahuasca was, I had been denying in recovery, you try to become good.
Mm.
You see yourself as bad object. If you've been getting loaded and running around, you see yourself as either bad or not enough or whatever your shame wound is.
It's like even the notion of getting clean, right? It's
100%.
Like
100%. I mean, we all wrestle with that, but in recovery, what's partially what's motivating you is guilt because I've been being a bad boy or whatever,
Yeah.
So I had that carrying from my own trauma from when I was little. And so there was a revelation in my early 30s that I had been sort of pursuing an image of the good and not connected to who I am and what I wanted or my own desire or self, any of that.
Yeah.
And so it actually motivated me to go do psychedelics, and that came out of a difficult moment. And so the genesis of my psychedelic experience was around empathy for myself. Now, when you're doing ayahuasca, and I went to Peru, you create an intention. And I was stuck between two intentions, which I think tells you so much about me still, but definitely at the time. One intention was I want to open my heart and learn to give and receive more love.
Mm.
That was one that I was holding. My other was I want to know what this place is.
This place.
Existence.
Okay.
Yeah. How about so
I wasn't sure if you meant the treatment center
I
that you were at.
I don't know what this podcast studio is. Before I was even here, that's a real psychedelic trip, dude. Philosophy. I love philosophy. I study philosophy. And I went with the philosophical one, right? So,
okay.
Interesting, right? It tells you about me.
Yeah.
On day 3, I did 7 ceremonies in the Shipibo tradition. On day 3, I was overwhelmed with information. Mm. I didn't want to know any. I said TMI. I don't want to know anymore about whatever what's going on here.
We've done enough here. Yeah.
Got it. I called it the infinity of forms. I said, okay, I got it. And I switched my intention to giving and receiving more love. And
Okay.
I got that.
Yeah. And did that succeed? I'll tell you why I asked this question because it's interesting to me, but did it succeed in shutting down the part that had become overwhelming? Like, did shifting your intention help to contain the part?
There was a whole other, there's so many things that happened there that make it difficult to track that through line in a simple way. But what I would say is what I came to recognize was that what I really wanted was not more information.
Yes. The reason why I ask is because there is a general applicability here, and I sort of feel the need for the sake of the listeners and viewers, just in case there's something in here that people can borrow from, but something I'm a big believer in, it's part of how I was trained, is to ask yourself at any given moment, even if you're having an experience that's slightly displeasurable, like, what would you like right now? What do I want? Because in this world of infinite kind of quantum possibilities, it helps to kind of constrain the field, and you can get more of what you want by getting clarity around saying what you want. So it's just very interesting to me. It kind of pops up in my head to hear you say that there was a moment where it was kind of like, okay, this is enough. I'm going to rejigger my intention to get to something slightly different. It
would just make me think of there's a great quote by Huston Smith who wrote World Religions. He's an awesome dude. The quote is, "You can never get enough of what you don't really want."
Ooh, say more about that.
I mean, when I work in treatment, so when I'm running groups, and I used to sometimes use that part of the book, I talked about it in terms of addiction. Like, oh,
Yeah.
the reason why you keep going back to this behavior or these types of relationships is because it's not what you really want.
Yeah.
So you can never get enough of what you don't really want.
Yes.
It's never
Yes.
satisfying.
Yeah. It kind of makes me think about the notion of manifestation and in terms of how people will sometimes say, we're technically always manifesting. It's just that oftentimes we're manifesting what we don't want.
Sure.
And at that level of like what you resist persists,
Yeah.
you know, it's like sometimes you just get inundated with like
I
more
would
and
love
more of
to-
what you don't want.
I don't know if it's in this moment,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that there's a split in my way of thinking about therapy
Sure.
that I'm really curious about. I'm curious of your opinion at some point. Could be now, but
Yeah.
Yeah?
Why don't you just go for it?
Cool.
I'll bring us back later.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I design treatment programs,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm a big fan of psychoanalysis. Huge.
Mhm.
And I'm not nearly as critical as many people are.
Same, just so you know. Mm-hmm.
And for me, there is still this very interesting question. In a psychoanalytic frame, you're essentially attempting to work with people's guilt and shame. For me, as
Yes,
primary.
at least in part. Mhm.
Yeah. And bring to consciousness how that's operating in their personality in some sense. But you're looking at, you're looking at the schmutz, you're looking at the difficult, you're looking at the difficult stuff, you're looking at the self-attack, you're looking at the inner critic, you're looking at the superego, right?
Yeah.
And you're going back to what happened before that was difficult. And you're also in recovery, you're looking at your foibles and where you missed the mark and, all of this stuff. And I think about that and I hold that then with more of a positive psychology, more of a sort of Adlerian
Yes.
way of approaching, where I wonder how much you think it's necessary
To go back?
as a therapist to get into the mud.
Oh, it's such a good question. And I actually love how all of this is sort of interweaving, because we are still in this kind of nature of reality space as far as I'm concerned. So I am a huge fan of psychoanalysis. I sort of consider myself in a lot of ways to be a product of psychoanalysis, among other things. It's not like product of psychoanalysis uniquely, but when I was in my training years, and I'm the kind of person who's had, enough therapy to kill a horse in my life, and a lot of it has been analysis. And so I never went through full-blown analytic training, but I was trained as a therapist, sort of to think analytically. And one of the things that I think is often misunderstood about analysis, if you just think about the divide of, like, let's say, being an analyst or being trained in that way versus the way maybe sometimes people think about it when they're not trained in that way, is that, it began with Freud and Jung and their contemporaries, but it has grown and evolved a lot since then. And as the thinking has grown and evolved, a lot of what it has become more oriented towards is relationality and intersubjectivity, the sort of intersubjective field and that kind of stuff. And there is a kind of a theory in the analytic space that I think is so deep and rich, which is just that the past is always present. So you don't actually have to go back at all, because you're sort of dealing with the past by dealing with the present.
Beautiful.
So in terms of, when I think about this stuff as someone who continues to practice as a psychotherapist, what I am so often tracking in my work is actually like what's happening between me and this person right now, because the past continues to be present. So it's like however this person is feeling in our work with each other. I could pick anything off the top of my head. Someone is worried that they're going to offend me. It's like there's so much richness in that space in the present moment, because the past is continuing to sort of refract in these ways. But no, I actually don't think... I think that it can sometimes be useful to sort of think about the past only because we can create new narratives around it, and we can recontextualize things. We can learn to tell ourselves a better story and that kind of stuff. But if I'm working with somebody that does not want to go backwards for whatever reason, it could be a traumatic thing, or it could just be a sort of like, I've done that before, I don't want to keep doing that. It's just kind of like, fucking great. Like, where do you want to go from here? Like, it's all, it constellates in the present.
That makes sense. I guess I wonder about, again, I think for me, and it's also in a lot of the work that I do, what I'm paying attention to is guilt and shame. I mean, for whatever reason, it's just like a hyper focus of mine. Well, not for whatever reason, I think for good reason. And, I work in the addiction field.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what's happening in addiction is bypassing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it happening with people.
Bypassing how? Just to clarify that.
I mean, there's various forms. Like, what do I mean by bypassing, or what types of bypassing?
Either, both. I just want to make sure people listening know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think one thing I'm always tracking in working with people is their capacity, ego strength, their capacity to be able to hold guilt in a moment, and their capacity to hold guilt without collapsing into shame or collapsing into a binary.
Yeah, yeah.
When people have a lot of trauma and a lot of shame, as you know, there is very little differentiation between, oh, this was a bad moment and I'm a bad person. And so a bad moment is the match that broke the camel's back, right?
Absolutely.
Because there's so much shame there to be in the tension of feeling like you did something wrong in a moment feels like too much. They project out or project in, and they try to bypass the feeling of guilt as opposed to being able to attribute appropriate proportionality to it emotionally and cognitively and be like, yeah, okay, it was a bad moment. Let me think about that for, today, and I'll come back to you and whatever. And yeah, it's a little bit difficult, but I'm okay.
Yes.
Right. So I'm working with people, and I think this happens with a lot of people, that either it's like a narcissistic bypass, a spiritual bypass, borderline splits, all of the ways in which people attempt to avoid being with the interpersonal, which feels too threatening. And so I wonder about the necessity for people to be able to make the connections of what happened in my past in order to achieve some self-compassion and self-understanding, or a larger sort of almost narrative container, to be able to go, oh, that's why this is going on, right? Like, meaning to make sense of it in such a way that helps bolster the ego strength to be able to tolerate that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when I hear you talk about guilt and shame, or was it guilt that you said, or am I bringing up guilt?
No, I said guilt and shame.
Guilt and shame, and then I think about the nature of blame, because there is this impulse that it's something that I just notice so much, that the impulse to blame someone or something for whatever it is. And it could be self-blame, it could be blame of others. Someone here has to be responsible. So like, who is to blame for this thing? And it's interesting because, of course, I can't help but feel like there's always like sort of some value in going backwards if we can. But again, it's present in the moment. That if somebody is struggling with a tendency to blame, to attribute guilt to a certain party, how do we help people to understand that from like a present moment awareness sense? And I almost wonder if that brings us full circle back to psychedelics, because there is this ability when you're working in that way to, it's almost like, do you have to go backwards in a psychedelic sense in order to get some distance from these concepts? Yeah, like it just is, you just sort of, put a stick of dynamite in it, right?
Not at all, but
on some level.
Not at all, but I do very much think that often when people do psychedelic work, it's it's an opening, so more structures that were more rigid become more flexible, more open, new neural pathways, all of that. And so I think very frequently old material starts to come up and become recontextualized, not necessarily in the psychedelic experience, although sometimes, but I think it's very rare that somebody would do psychedelics a few times and not have material either seen in a new way or new material altogether that starts to come up.
So in your work, because we were talking about you before, and now I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit more about the people that you work with at Recover Integrity and what you notice. What are some of the things that you maybe notice that let you know that a person is stuck, or that hallucinogens would help something move?
That's great. Great. Well, first I want to make a distinction. I have two programs, Recover Integrity, which is an adult dual diagnosis male program, and then a young adult program called Antedote. We don't use classic psychedelics in either. They're not legal in California. We do utilize,
although ketamine treatments, right?
We do utilize ketamine at Recover Integrity, and now and then with young adults in certain circumstances, we've done that.
Yeah.
So that's just an important thing to say out loud. And I do think the law is important for a variety of reasons. I'm not just saying that as some, whatever. I actually think people underestimate the importance of laws and rules.
As like a kind of a container of sorts, like as something that, or how so?
Oh, as the thing that allows all of us to exist and reap the benefits of being in a society that I think people are very fast to write off. And make,
particularly these days, I suppose, but we don't have to go down that road.
So there's that's a whole different discussion. But so the first question is, what are criteria for stuckness where I think normative treatment is not working anymore? It's a good question.
It's a big one too.
Yeah. Let me reflect on that for a minute.
Take your time.
And obviously there's not one answer. Different people are stuck in different ways. These days, I think the things that I've paid most attention to is the level of connectedness that I feel. Because we work in small groups, I'm working with 10, 15 people at a time, and I'm there hours and hours. So I'm spending a lot of time, and I run 5 hours worth of group a week at one and more at the other. So the thing that I pay most close attention to is how people are constellating and the felt sense I have of how they're taking part in the community. Because people orient themselves in very different ways. I mean, just as a funny example of somebody we have there now, we did an alumni picnic, and we were barbecuing and playing music, and everybody, just watch where people go. It's like, okay, everybody's here. These two people are over there. Then this guy's like by himself 5 feet away. This was like very early on in his treatment, so we didn't even know him that well. And I was like, oh. And that very much is sort of a metaphor for probably his experience in his family system, his experience in life, and very much his challenge in joining recovery. He feels exiled, I guess, in some way.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of clinical things happening and even neurocognitive things happening as well. So anyway, we had a neuropsych, right? But ultimately, the felt sense of connectedness is I think, a very big deal. And then people's capacity to learn.
Yeah.
So some people can have a moment or lots of moments of insight, and they can be connected, but they don't hold anything, right? So nothing's being held. And I'm like, what's going on there? So sometimes that's a sign of like, oh man, there's some block there, or maybe it's neurological, right? But something's happening there. So those two are big, and then we can start there. Those are two.
Sure. Yeah. I'm also wondering about instances where a person is really struggling to stay sober, because it brings us back to what you were saying before about potential downsides and risks, which I think a lot of, I could just sort of say like fellow clinicians on my side of the field, perhaps overly index for, the concerns that they have about potential downsides and risks.
Yeah, great.
And, maybe not always being willing to recognize that if somebody could die from their addiction, it's like there's risks all over the place here. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's most common for me that I would see and then recommend something like ketamine or another psychedelic if it's not in my program is rigidity. I mean, rigidity for me is the sort of obvious case where somebody has some, let's say, infrastructure and capacity for functionality, but they're rigid and they're cut off, and they're overly, cognitive, or they intellectualize, or you can't feel them in relationships. So, I mean, I tend to think psychedelics are just fantastic for rigidity. So that's for me the obvious case. What you're saying, I think, is huge. From the recovery community, certain aspects of the recovery community think that I'm somewhat radical. I don't think so at all. I mean, I mean, for me, and it goes to what you're saying, which is, from my point of view, if somebody is using fentanyl or methamphetamine and they're chronically relapsing and they've been to treatment 7 times, we're concerned about psilocybin.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there's no risk there, but it's sort of people don't calculate the risk of not doing something.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're looking at the liability of the thing you're doing, not the liability of if I don't do it. One of my greatest regrets is I have a very good friend, and her husband was dying of cancer. He's actually a wonderful psychologist, incredible clinician. And we had talked about doing a psilocybin session, end of life psilocybin session. And I got scared. I got scared because he was really fragile and I thought he might die on my couch. And I thought his wife, who I'm also very close with, was going to blame me, even though she was kind of on board. And so it wasn't that it was like, oh, I'm not going to do it. I just didn't make it happen.
Yeah.
And it was fear. And I was like, oh my God,
yes.
Ugh. And he died a very difficult death.
Yeah.
And it's one of my larger regrets, know, and you don't realize that till after you don't do the thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. The way in which like fear can stop us.
Yeah.
It feels important for me to say too, and this is where we get into such interesting territory with kind of like laws and regulations to your point, and also kind of cultural mores. But there are some pretty incredible examples of drugs like ibogaine creating really truly kind of spontaneous remission effectively with heroin addiction and that kind of stuff, where part of what we see at least in sort of anecdotal sort of literature. And I can't recall actually right now exactly how much this has been empirically studied, although I do think there have been some empirical studies that the sort of the hold that addiction can have over you can be spontaneously evaporated.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, listen, the 12-step founders and Carl Jung thought that the only cure for addiction in the 30s was a spontaneous remission from a spiritual experience.
Right.
I mean, the whole 12-step culture, which is by far the most successful, robust support system for addicts and alcoholics, was built on the idea that a spiritual awakening could create spontaneous remission.
Yes.
And how do we build communities to attempt to inculcate a spiritual awakening? So it happens. The ibogaine numbers in the clinics are a little bit better or maybe comparable to something like 60 to 90 days of treatment.
Huh, okay.
But it's important to point out that is usually over a 5 or 10 day period. And the infrastructure for integration and containment and the recovery infrastructure, what does it mean for me to be a person that recovers using ibogaine in a normally abstinence-based culture, barely exists.
Right.
And so the rates are roughly the same, but the cost and the time are completely different. I mean, one of the things I'm doing has been working on opening up a psychedelic treatment program, which is probably going to launch in about 6 months.
Okay.
And it's to address this kind of major issue where there are things about a well-run treatment community that are phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal, because nobody gets to stop their lives, connect, be in a place of wisdom, have a place that has clinical expertise, address the nutrition. I mean, address all of it. Like a good treatment program can be incredibly holistic. If you add in, for the appropriate clients, psychedelics to a long-term treatment program, 60 days or more, I mean, it will have its issues, I'm sure, but I think it'll be nothing like it. I think there'll be nothing like it.
There's a direction I'm wanting to go in. I want to take us on a tiny left turn, but before I do, I think something I just want to comment on because it's so interesting to me here is I think about cultural values that we have, at least in the United States, about the value of hard work.
Sure.
And it feels like one of the things that some people are a little bit reticent around is it's almost like what value is lost if we make anything easier for people? It's almost like, is 90 days of treatment better if you have to work really hard for it? It's kind of a Protestant thing we've kind of got going in the United States. In our culture writ large. But is there anything you want to say?
Like cheating your way to spirituality or cheating your way to
cheating
something.
Your way to
I think we can tend to think that way. I don't think there's nothing to that. I mean, so I wouldn't say that like, oh, there's no truth in that, right? Like, I do think that there is something true about the things that I find most valuable and that I know to be true about me and my character and my life weren't easy.
Yeah.
So there is something true about that. However, having a psychedelic experience that loosens or frees you from the grip of particular patterns does not give you a shortcut to having to figure out how to live your life. It's not a magic bullet in that
Absolutely.
sense of it, right?
No, that's a very, very good kind of clarification and correction.
And there's particular psychedelic trajectories that people have. So, a lot of the time the trajectory I see is there's, this really big experience. People get very excited about psychedelics. Certain personalities tend to overdo it, not in a way that's necessarily detrimental, but they get really into doing psychedelics a lot. Then they start having bad experiences. Then they slow down. And then they start to do long-term integration after a couple of years where it's like, okay, I do a couple of psychedelic sessions a year, or I do it this way. And, there's a maturity kind of trajectory that happens like with everything. Everything is a process. Everything happens over time. So I don't think there's nothing to it. But I don't think anybody who has a loved one who is suffering from a, major depressive disorder or a horrible addiction, and sees what can happen in 3 days, in 6 hours, in the proper container with the proper preparation and post work, would hold that opinion after.
No, 100%. But I think that I'm talking about more the cultural mores that shape our laws and that also shape what constitutes empirically validated treatment. That there's a reason why we have been slow to adopt this.
Well, that's an interesting question. What do you think? What's your? I can think about it.
Well, I think a lot of it is fear.
Yeah.
I think it's fear. It's over-indexing for what could go wrong without thinking about what could go right.
Yeah.
I do think a lot of this stuff is shifting as we speak, and I wouldn't be surprised in the next 5, 10, 20 years things could change a lot.
I'm mainly on that side. Obviously, I'm here talking about it was like a treatment program.
Oh yeah.
The other side of it for me is psychedelic medicine is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
From, ketamine all the way up to 5-MeO-DMT to ibogaine. These are, nuclear power when it comes to consciousness. It's
such a good way to put it.
Really, really, and I have had psychedelic experiences. Again, it could be my paranoia in a moment, or it could be, caution that how we introduce these medicines into community and society.
Yes. Where like shadows are present and we can mean that in more than one way.
This is a vision I have. This is, a little bit weird, but it's a vision I had in psychedelic experience. I had a vision. I was like, 10 years ago. And in the vision, what came to me, and I don't know if it's true or not, I don't even care, it just was the vision, was that humanity at different points had access to different orders of reality, often through using psychedelic medicine. And each time it had failed. Each time society had regressed post. That was a vision.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've had paranoid visions. I've had, stuff that's come true. But I took it somewhat seriously and I went, hey, we should probably pay very close attention to how we introduce this into our communities and move slowly.
Well, you're teeing me up perfectly for the left turn that I just mentioned. But part of what comes up for me is I just sort of think about the notion of the ego, which is a big word. It can mean more than one thing.
Right.
But, part of what it does is mediate id impulses and superego impulses. And there's a part of me that can imagine how what you're saying could be true because we're sort of like, in some ways, unleashing our ids in a way.
Interesting. Yeah,
in a way. But so, Bree, let me ask you really quickly. Are you okay? I couldn't see you. I just want to do a quick time check because I'm like on another planet right now.
35.
Okay, perfect. That I kind of had a feeling that that's what we were looking at. But so I want to shift gears ever so slightly because there is something that's kind of just dancing in this conversation that's so interesting to me. And, you and I have only met a couple of times, but every time we have an opportunity to chat, the conversation always gets kind of quantum and in ways that I really love.
It's awesome, yeah.
And, I'm just sort of thinking about my own history with this stuff because I have done hallucinogens, but they were not the thing that really ultimately created what I would call effectively a spiritual awakening. Like the avenue for me for that came differently. I sort of went down a different kind of quantum physics rabbit hole and found the Akashic records. And I've done previous episodes on this stuff. So the people that listen to this podcast are perhaps familiar with that. But when you were talking before about your own psychedelic experiences, you were kind of talking about the way in which psychedelics can open us up to something that's greater. And there's a really interesting, it's so endlessly fascinating to me, the way in which the brain mediates this stuff, right? Because the brain is the thing that kind of mediates our own, the way that we look at life and make sense of reality and all of this stuff. And it's also how we have mystical experiences. Sure. And, it's this kind of endlessly complex organism. And so I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about this notion of higher order experiences and your own, you said something before the tape got rolling about, what did you call it? The wolf experience that was the empirical miracle. Yeah, sure. And I just would love to, at least for a moment, kind of dance in this space with you, because I have a feeling you just have a lot of wisdom to offer, and probably just some very quantum kind of thoughts about this stuff. But do you want to start by maybe telling me where your brain goes as I start connecting these dots? Can you feel the left turn I'm trying to make?
Yeah, I mean, there's some thinkers that I've been engaged with that are attempting to bridge cognitive science and Neoplatonic thought and spirituality, and attempting to find accurate language maps that are the bridge between science and spirituality, which has had a split since the Enlightenment, right? Sort of religion and spirituality split off during the birth of modern science. And so I actually think that where my mind immediately goes is that we're in this very privileged time, all kinds of issues, but a very privileged time where science and spirituality are actually starting to bridge, and very serious scientists and very serious spiritual people are participating in a new conversation, because we've come to realize that the MAPS scientific materialism is dead. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's hardly anybody who I take seriously who's a scientific materialist. So that's kind of where my mind goes.
Will you unpack the term Neoplatonic for us?
Sure. It's a complex term, but basically it comes out of Plato. Mm-hmm. And Plato had a system of thought, or we extracted a system of thought from his writings that had a schema to it that was emanatory, so that there is a sort of a source of creation, or the one. It's called in Neoplatonic thought from Plotinus. And there are ontologically real levels of existence from the one to our so-called material existence here. And there's some complexity about how that kind of works with each other. But if you're just imagining, there's closer and further away from source, and that each level is real and each level is interacting with the level next to it. And you could think about levels like scales. So if we think about the body, for instance, we have the quantum probability level of reality and of our existence, us. We have a quantum probability happening right now inside of us, is what science tells us, right? That's not woo-woo, that's true. We just don't understand it well. We have an atomic level, we have quarks, we have an atomic level, and it's a real scale or level of existence. Then we have a molecular level, and then we have a cellular level, then we have an organ level, then we have a body, then we have our niche environment, right? So these are ontologically real scales that interact with each other, but are also distinct. And if we can imagine that there is a multiscalar schema that exists beyond what we've mapped. I mean, why wouldn't that be the case when we know that there are certain limits that our bodies have in what it can perceive at any given time?
Yes. The way, something I'll jump in here with, because I so often think about this, and it helps to kind of bridge these different ways of thinking about things for a moment, is that it's fascinating to think that our human senses, sight, touch, all of that stuff, is designed to interact with the world at the level of classical physics. But we know from quantum mechanics and that kind of stuff that is not reality per se. So it's interesting to think that, and there's kind of an interesting thought that's coming to mind for me that I mostly just want to kind of put into the field, and you respond to this obviously however you want, but mostly I think for our listeners, I'm just feeling compelled to say this. It's really interesting to think about the nature of psychosis, right? Because I think that for a long time, people were afraid to have conversations like this because of what could sound crazy. And it's interesting to think that, like, you know, psychosis is a real phenomenon. It's a thing that we can talk about in a lot of ways. One very simple way of saying it is that there's something happens that makes it so that this fractalization of reality becomes hard, if not impossible, to hold. You know, as someone who has worked with psychotic patients and has a lot of experience with that, there are things that we don't understand about psychotic experiences, but I think what we can say is that there's a sort of a fracturing of the ego that makes it so that the very thing that you just said is like, it's like it's impossible to comprehend. But there's this desire that I have to kind of bring it more and more into the fold of public discourse, that we can have these well-held conversations about the nature of reality and how humans experience it. And so I don't know, that was what came to me.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. I think one of my I'm really into recovery, so I'm really into learning, because recovery is a process of learning.
Yes. I'm like learning and growth is my entire.
And I think so much learning actually comes from relationship. Like I'm sitting here talking to you.
Yeah.
And we've had a couple of deep conversations. And if we really started to spend time together, I could begin to get a feel for your perspective, for what it's like to be you. And so I actually think so much of our learning comes from interacting with people and starting to see the world through their eyes.
Yes.
And there's a guy named Dr. John Vervaeke, who's both a friend and a teacher, who I've listened to 1 million of his lectures, and now we've had a couple of Zooms and we've exchanged papers and stuff like that. And I got to experience the world through his eyes.
Yeah.
And what's it like, how he experiences being in a body. Now, he happens to be like a highly intellectual guy. So it comes with all this like really cool theory, but ultimately through his gesticulation with his fingers and, you know, what he's into, like when I'm with this guy, it enhances what it is like to be having my experience as a person, because I get to try it on a little bit.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I have tried to do in my group work in some sense is let the people get to know me, not in a narcissistic way. But I'm like, hey, come look at this with me. Look at it this way. Hey, experience this.
100%.
You know, and in my moving and in my connecting, because a huge part of my recovery journey has been getting more and more in my body.
Yes.
Connecting more and more to my heart, both my physiological heart and my symbolic heart.
Yes.
And really, really learning how to feel here and vital. And people can pick up on that through interaction.
Absolutely.
And then there's all of the theory and all the fun stuff we love to talk about. But so much to me is that, like, can you relate to me and see a little bit through my eyes, you know?
God, there's so much in there I want to respond to, because I think you're so spot on. And so there's this very clunky theory in the field of psychology, which is the notion of theory of mind, which is part of what I hear you saying. You know, it's this thing that is sort of extends beyond and is sort of greater than even empathy per se. But it's like, can I enter your subjective universe and try to kind of understand it from the inside out? And I do think that it's a really big part of what's missing in our culture right now. Like, there's such a tremendous collapse on empathy and nuance and theory of mind that a lot of people are not. I mean, what a fucking foreign concept that you just laid down for us, for a lot of people, right? And yet I know exactly what you mean. And I think that there is this way. I really hear you in the kind of not wanting to sound narcissistic about it. But I think when I think about my role as a therapist, part of what I'm often aware of is that I am allowing people to borrow from my consciousness in the sense that if I am working with somebody who is inclined to blame, just to use the sort of example from du jour that we've been talking about, if I am able to have a more expansive awareness that is not oriented towards blame, then some of that is going to be transmitted from the actual conversation that we have, but part of it is transmitted through my actual presence. Like, I might not ever have to say out loud the thing that I'm thinking, but when you create an intersubjective field, you create this like field of awareness. And I can feel it in you very much. I want you to know one of the reasons why I was so excited to have this conversation with you today is because I think that when a person has done a lot of work on themselves, there's a way in which they are embodied in their own presence and they walk with that in the world. And you very much so walk with that in the world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. give credit to my mom and my dad a little bit.
I love that. I love that.
My mom.
Well, exactly. And yourself, because you have done an extraordinary amount of work on yourself and in cultivating the presence that you move through the world with.
Thank you for that.
So,
can I say one little thing about it? Because this is a great map for listeners.
Please.
You. So one of the things that John Vervaeke teaches that I thought was so helpful, and I love to teach it, is he says, there's different types of learning, different types of knowing.
Yeah.
And he says, we've lived in an age for 300 years in the West of propositional tyranny, where we think the only kind of learning is learning through Aristotelian logic, through just, logic.
Yes.
This makes sense, this doesn't,
Yeah.
And he says, well, actually, there are 4 types of knowing, maybe more, but I think 4 covers a lot. And he says there's the propositional learning and knowing. He says there's the perspectival, meaning the example he uses is there are people that control the Mars rover on Mars. And there are these joysticks and headsets that they use to control the Mars rover. And they have to embody what it's like to be a Mars rover. And they're using their imaginal capacity
I love that.
to take on the perspective of the Mars rover on
Yes.
Mars.
Yes.
Or I can find myself doing a dance. I like to dance a lot. And I go, oh my God, I got that from this client who was doing that little jig. And like later that day, I'm doing just the exact rhythm that client was doing. And I'm like, oh, it's I'm embodying their perspective.
Yes.
So there's there's the propositional, the perspectival, procedural.
Yeah.
Which is really important when you're working with certain clients, because if the procedural mind is off and they can't follow certain steps to do something, it becomes, that's the sort of learning issue that I was talking about. So if there's something going on in the procedural, you have to address it cognitively because people need to be able to follow 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps in order to function, and especially in something as complex as recovery or something like that. So there's the procedural learning, and then his favorite, which is probably the biggest, is participatory learning. The difference between reading a book about baseball
Yes.
and then playing baseball.
Yes.
And the difference between playing baseball and becoming a baseball player.
Right.
It's also one of the reasons, and this is controversial, that I'm hesitant about getting rid of the word addict as a label. So if there's like a stigma against, like, don't label me like that. And that's obviously a personal choice, and I'm not some fascist about it. But I always say there is something ontological
100%.
about becoming an addict.
Yes.
Like you can see somebody who's become, like, it's in the being aspect, it's not your soul, and right. But I'm not so quick to go, oh, no, this is just like some passing cold that you have.
Yeah.
No, this actually, just like you could be a baseball player or you could be an artist, you can be an addict. From one perspective.
Absolutely. And is there perhaps some value or benefit in identifying that way per se, because it enables you, it's kind of like you can't solve the problem, you're not acknowledging this happening. So if you can adopt the identity, you can actually work to resolve it even at the level of your identity.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Now, again, that's personal. Each person gets to choose how they, what resonates with them. So I'm not fascist about it. But as a whole, I wouldn't say society should just get rid of that idea, because I do think it's deep at the level of self-concept and identity.
Yeah.
And even deeper than that, actually, in some ways.
Just to kind of draw us to a close here, because I obviously I could talk to you for the rest of the day. But you did mention that there's this story that, why do I keep forgetting?
Empiricism in philosophy means that which is experienced through the senses.
It's not
right?
that I can't remember the word empirical. It's that you just you have this clever way of saying
empirical miracle.
The empirical miracle.
I was
For
a
some
rapper,
reason,
so I was a hip hop.
I guess that's why I can't.
I like
it's like a white lady brain fog. I can't remember
rappers,
empirical miracle. But will you please tell us this story, because I think
Sure.
it could be a fabulous way to wrap up this episode.
Sure.
Okay.
So there's a couple of chapters to it.
Okay.
But it was January 16th, 2024, so very recently.
Okay.
And in the morning, I come into my office at Recover Integrity, and I have a prayer and meditation practice. I pray out of a Jewish Siddur prayer book. And then I do a meditation that I borrowed from a friend of mine. I call it the Jewel Tree of Life meditation.
Yeah.
And so I imagine all of my relatives and the people that I love and the people in my community, and I put them as jewels in my tree, and I pray for them, their protection
Yeah.
and love and peace and all the good stuff. So I do that most mornings, and it's sort of set. You know, I have like 40 people, but now and then people come into my consciousness, or somebody just passed away, and I pray for their spirit, or this kind of thing. And on this particular morning, my great grandparents came into my consciousness on my mother's side, and I always went to my grandparents, but I never included the next generation, not ever. Right? Because you have to stop somewhere. You can't just keep going and going and going. So I stopped at the grandparents, but they came into my consciousness, and the names were Ida, Simon, Harry, and Nana. These were and I knew them. They died when I was still very young.
Okay.
So I included them in my prayer. Then I went to work. Then I had an internal family systems therapy session for myself on Zoom in my office.
Cool.
Okay. I'm sitting in front of my computer. I have this therapist named Ted, and I'm working on my fear of death. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and I realized I and everybody was going to die. It was a commercial, I think probably for pharmaceuticals. And I saw two old people, and I had the thought, oh, they're going to die.
Yeah.
And whatever little developmental transition I was at, I went, they're going to die. And nobody ever talked to me about death. I never thought about it. And I went, oh, they are going to die. And I went, oh, I'm going to die. My parents are going to die. And everybody's going to die, and nobody can do anything about it. Now, I'm giving you the narrative. The reality was the abyss. And I had a panic attack, but I didn't know what a panic attack was. And I didn't tell anybody for a long time. And I was by myself. And I think it traumatized me because death was nothing, was the no thing, which just terrified me at that age because I didn't have control. And so I was working on the young part of me that got traumatized in that. So I'm working with a protector part. And all of a sudden, the protector part steps aside. I have my eyes closed, and I'm working in my imagination. And this giant wolf shows up in my field of vision, which is not a normative experience for me. I don't dream about wolves. I'm not obsessed with wolves. And I don't usually have that vivid of an imagination. But it's a wolf's head. It's about this big, and it's right in front of me in my imagination, and it's very clear. And the wolf leans forward and puts its nose on my face, and I crack. And I start bawling for like 20 minutes. And I don't really cry that much. I don't really cry that much in therapy. And all I kept saying was, I've never felt love like this. I've never felt love like this. 120%. I've never been loved like this. I just kept saying it over and over again. And the therapist sort of sat there and witnessed it. And then the session was over. At the time, I was studying James Hillman. And then I went back to my day. And I had an appointment to go to the treatment program. It's called Beit Teshuva. It was a Jewish treatment program that I got sober at, and I was the assistant rabbi at for marketing. I own a treatment program. I'd been there in 2 years. I didn't really go back that much, but it was a holy place for me. And I didn't want to go because I hate marketing. So I go to this marketing meeting. And in the middle of it, I'm like in this very odd state, maybe because of this thing that happened 3 hours before. But all of a sudden, I'm like, I got to go look at the Torah, which is the sacred text of the Jewish people. And there's a congregation and an ark and a kind of a whole thing over there. And I looked at my friend Adam, who's there, and I said, can I go look at the Torah? And I don't know why I said that. I'm not a Torah fixated person. I don't know what was happening, but I was drawn towards it. It was just acting. So I go walk into the sanctuary, but there's a group going on. And I didn't want to interrupt the group because I was a special person there. They would have interrupted the group to pull out the Torah. I was like, that's too much. I don't want to interrupt. Don't worry about it. And I'm standing over in the corner with Adam at the sanctuary. And there's these things called yartzites. They're these... it's a tradition that it's mystical and it gets into stuff, that you light a candle in the anniversary of a loved one's death. And you say a certain prayer. But they don't light candles anymore in temples. So now they have these little brass plaques with these little lights that you turn on the anniversary of somebody's death. Okay, so I'm standing near 500 plaques on the wall. And I'm looking at the group and we're just talking. And I know that I have some relatives on the wall and I'm looking. And I probably have like 8 or 9 relatives on the wall because I was there forever. And I saw Ida and Simon, and they were both lit up. And I was like, well, they didn't die the same week. Like, why are they both lit up? This is really weird. And I look at the dates, and I go to Adam. I'm like, why are my great-grandparents' yartzites on? Like, what's going on? He's like, I don't know. And I was like, all right, whatever. I didn't even think about it. They were about to walk out, and I looked down, and it was Harry and Nana, and they were both lit up. I have a picture on my phone. And I said, they didn't die the same week. And I went down and I go to Adam. I said, why are all 4 of my great-grandparents' yartzites lit up on that wall? And he goes, I have no idea. And I'm like, I'm a cognitively suspicious person. And I said, is Susan still running this? She's still charging this wall? He's like, yes. I go and I know she didn't do it, but I go to Susan and I'm like, did you fiddle with my great grandma? She's like, no. Then of course it dawns on me, oh my God, like, wait a minute. I included them in my meditation this morning. Then I recognized, wait a minute, I was working on my fear of death in that IFS session.
Mm-hmm.
Then I realized that wolf was not a part.
Yeah.
In the IFS work, they call that a guide. I was studying Damon's, James Hillman, Damon's guides and how guides and messengers work in the world at that period of time. This was January 16th, 2024. I got sober in that place January 19th, 2003, 21 years before. That week, 21 years before, I was 42 at that time. It was the halfway point of my life, and it was one of the only times that my sobriety was going to be the halfway point of my life, right? 21 years sober, I'm 42 years old. That week in that place where I got clean, where I was the rabbi in a temple, that was happening, okay?
Yeah.
So I went, what the hell is going on? The only thing I couldn't figure out was why was it January 16th and not January 19th, which is my actual sobriety day, which is that Friday. This was a Wednesday. And for a month, I couldn't figure it out. I knew it was a miracle, but I couldn't figure out why it was on that date. And then I realized whenever I tell my sobriety story, I tell the truth. And the truth is I got pulled over 3 days in a row before I got arrested and then went to rehab to get out of trouble. 3 days in a row. And I always say, the LAPD was my Eskimo or my guide. There's actually another little piece to the story. But the first day that I got pulled over, the first intervention where I was warned, that's what I call it. I say always get 2 warnings before there's something happens. You get 2 warnings, right? The first day was January 16th, 2003, 21 years to the day.
Yeah.
It was the first time a messenger came and warned me, hey, you're on the wrong path. This is going to go bad for you.
Wow.
That's my empirical miracle story. I've analyzed it 100 ways. I've written 50 pages on it to try to make sense of how all of that could happen.
Yeah.
And there's only one way I could make sense of it, which is that it's an empirical miracle.
I love it. I just will say that I have stories like that, so I believe it. I get it. One question that I have is, do you have any theories about how the kind of candles came to be lit, in the sense that?
Yeah, it was interesting. For me, it was completely irrelevant. Right?
Okay.
Like,
yeah.
My very logical self says some resident fiddled with them.
Right.
But that doesn't explain anything.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
yeah.
That doesn't explain why those 4 when I have another 5
and why the
relatives.
person may have felt like strangely compelled to do that, sort of for reasons that maybe they didn't understand or something.
The book that I read about this kind of thing says actually that spirits communicate through the field, through electrical field.
Well, that actually was part of where I was going to go with that.
Yeah. For me, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Like, ultimately, I don't know. But I know what that day felt like. I mean, I know what the experience of that day was. I mean, the experience of that day was life-changing.
Yeah.
Like completely life-changing. I went, oh, wow. Because even if a resident fiddled with it, you still had the IFS experience. You still had the fact that I included them in that day. And I had not set foot in that place in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was there on that day and nobody,
I so hear you. I think one of the reasons why the thing with the lights is interesting to me is because one of the things that I track and notice in my own life and experience is the ways in which people can feel compelled to do things that they don't logically understand in the moment, because they're compelled by something that we don't understand.
Absolutely.
So it's like, even if somebody... It
Could
could have been the janitor, for Pete's sake, is like, somebody feels compelled to, I'm going to test this light and make sure it works, and they get distracted and they walk away, and then it's enough for you to have, a mystical experience.
Yeah. Superordinate order, right? I'm compelled to do something by forces and patterns that are invisible to me in the moment, but maybe I see over time. I do, this actually comes from psychedelic work. I think we will discover that scientifically, consciousness resides, not that this is what consciousness is, but I think as we have a deeper understanding of the fields that are operating in the bioelectric body, I do think consciousness resides in the electrical fields of our body. So I do have that as a theory. I do think that will be discovered at some point, but again, who knows?
I certainly can get on board with that. So what I will say for now is that In the interest of time, I would like to draw this episode to a close just because I'm not yet at like Joe Rogan levels of 3-hour-long conversations.
Cool.
But I do have, my own version of stories like that. And we're about to film a short bonus segment. So, if you're interested, we could talk more about that there. But for today, I just want to, thank you for doing this with me. Is there anything that I haven't asked you or anything that you want people to know before we wrap up?
I think this has been great. Okay. I'm totally cool. Thanks.
Thank you so much for doing this with me. You've been watching or listening to The Nature of Nurture with me, Dr. Leslie Carr, and I want to thank you for joining us. You can find Shai at recoverintegrity.com and antidotelab.com. Those links are in the show notes. And you can find me at thenatureofnurture.com. Many thanks to Shai for having this conversation with me. This episode was produced by me and Bree Corey. Thanks to Bree, Rick Barrio-Dill, and everyone at Slap Studios LA for helping to make my teenage dreams come true. If you found this conversation valuable, please let me know by leaving a review or rating, or by sharing the episode with at least one person who you think might enjoy it too. You can also like or subscribe on YouTube or in any podcast app that you can get your hands on. Thank you again for tuning in. I'll see you next time.